Good morning, everyone. I'd like to invite those who just arrived out in the hallway to join us as quickly as possible so we could begin this event. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. The Arab Center, Washington, D.C. is a one-year-old, nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization located here in the District of Columbia, dedicated to providing basically insight on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as furthering general understanding of economic, political, and social understanding of the Arab world, particularly at this time when the Arab world is going through unprecedented wave of change. Our mission, simply put, at the center is to serve as an authoritative research and policy analysis center on the Arab world, conducting timely, independent, and objective research on fundamental aspects of U.S.-Arab bilateral relations. We're affiliated with the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, which is emerging as the #1 think tank in the Arab world, based in Doha, Qatar. And it used to be known as the Doha Institute 4 years ago when it started. For those of you who might be familiar with the old name, it is directed by Dr. Azmi Bishara in Doha. And we're affiliated, of course, through the center there with a group of which we will try to leverage in our relationship with think tanks here in the Washington, D.C. area. The center there is affiliated with some 80 different types of research centers and think tanks throughout the Arab world. So we would like to serve as the kind of the link, local link here in DC with all these think tanks and research centers in the Arab world. We, again, part of the introduction here, let me say that we view ourselves as a progressive think tank, and a lot of our emphasis is different from traditional think tanks. We emphasize a lot our efforts and analysis on democracy, human rights, and justice in the Arab world, regardless of the traditional approaches, if you will, in research centers in the past. Today's event is focused on a controversial topic going back to September when President Obama announced that in response to the crisis of Syrian refugees that the U.S. would like, and he instructed his administration to begin working on absorbing 10,000 Syrian refugees in the United States, which is frankly a meager number compared to the magnitude of the crisis and the magnitude of the moral and political response of our allies, particularly in Europe. And the issue has become controversial ever since. And you had governors, you have presidential candidates talking mostly nonsense about this issue. And spreading, rumors and innuendos and false information about this, which has impacted, unfortunately, public opinion. So when you look at public opinion this morning, between 53 to 56% of the American public is opposed to bringing any Syrian refugees to the country. That propaganda, if you will, the opposition to this kind of took a toll on us as a country. But to help decipher this issue and what U.S. policy should be in terms of standing up and be counted, particularly as a country of immigrants, we have the right person, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, the Dean and Executive Professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He holds there the Edward and Howard Cruz Endowed Chair. He was also, the past couple of years, the James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Virginia and the Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University, 2012-2013. Ambassador Crocker is is a very well-known face for those of us who have been working on the Middle East for some time. He had probably one of the richest and most productive as far as I'm concerned, careers in U.S. diplomacy in the region, particularly at certain crucial times of Middle East history and U.S. foreign policy's history in the region. He served for 37 years in the region. He doesn't look like he served it, other than the gray hair. And I had the opportunity to visit with him during some of these tenures, important, I would add, tenures in the Middle East, in the region at that time, and where he was not only respected here at home, but he was very well respected also in the region. He retired in 2009 and was called back to active duty by President Obama to serve as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan in 2011. He has served as U.S. ambassador in the region 6 times, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. He has also served as the International Affairs Advisor to the National War College, where he joined the faculty in 2003. And from May to August 2003, he also was in Baghdad as the first director of governance for the Coalition Provisional Authority at a very crucial time for that period. He also served right after that as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs between 2001 and 2003. Ambassador Crocker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the nation's highest civilian award in 2009. And his other awards include the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Dwight Eisenhower Award, Presidential Distinguished and Meritorious Service Awards, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award in 2008 and 2012 again. He also received the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service twice in 1997 and 2008. And my favorite for diplomats, the Distinguished Public Service, the Award for Valor, and the American Foreign Service Association Rifkin Award for Creative Dissent. We never combine creative dissent with diplomacy, but definitely this is a man who has done very well and received the award for it. In September 2004, President Bush conferred on him the personal rank of Career Ambassador, which, as most of you know, is the highest in the Foreign Service in this country. In May 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced the establishment of the Ryan C. Crocker Award for Outstanding Achievement and Expeditionary Diplomacy. And in July 2012, he was named an honorary Marine, the 75th civilian to be honored as such since the founding of the Marine Corps in 1775, which is a great honor. For those of you who are not familiar with his article, which prompted us to invite him to this event, I refer you back to the Wall Street Journal on November 17, 2015, when his article, The Case for Accepting Syrian Refugees, kind of was a voice of sanity for us as a country in terms of how to deal with the Syrian refugees. It is an honor to introduce to you Ryan Crocker.
Khalil, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I can be introduced in a number of ways. I kind of like the way you did it. Another way I could be introduced would be pictorially. If you could imagine a picture of every significant U.S. foreign policy setback in the greater Middle East since 1979, sort of one picture for each disaster. I would be in every one of those pictures, you know, sort of first row, second from the left. It's you know, I'd heard that the Arab Center had been established, but when I got the email, what I really focused on was the sender, Khalil Jashan, and there was no question in my mind, even though I don't live in D.C., I do count my blessings, that I was going to be here because Khalil Jashan did the inviting. reminded him that we first met a quarter of a century ago, literally. 1985, I was in Deputy Director for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs at State, and I received a question from the State Department. What did I think of a meeting between Dick Murphy, our legendary Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Khalil Jashan? I thought about that for a minute, and I said, well, it'd be great if Khalil will agree to do it. So and the rest, as they say, is history. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, Khalil, and under the auspices of the Arab Center to discuss a truly critical issue, the issue of Syrian refugees and the U.S. response. In the description, you charitably put it as the evolving U.S. policy. That was charitable. We are facing, as everybody in this room knows, a crisis of truly global proportions. And as bad as it is now, on its current trajectory, it's going to be a whole lot worse in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years. Again, 4 million, roughly, Syrian refugees, over 7.5 million internally displaced inside Syria. By any measure, this is as bad as it's been in terms of scale and severity of any refugee crisis since World War II. What's missing that was present at the end of World War II is global leadership. This is not a Syrian problem. It is not a Middle Eastern problem. It is not a European problem. It is a global problem. And it is going to take global leadership, not to resolve it. That's going to be probably decades in the making, but simply to contain and manage it. There is only one nation that can exercise that leadership. That is the United States. And the United States, I'm very sad to say, as an American, is not leading. We're not even participating. Khalil referred to the op-ed I did for the Wall Street Journal on the 17th of November, 4 days after the Paris attacks. In that op-ed, I didn't argue for supporting President Obama's commitment to take 10,000 refugees. I called for the United States to take 100,000 Syrian refugees, 4 days after Paris. I've been arguing this for some time. I'm on the board of Mercy Corps. That's Mercy Corps' position, as it is of a number of other international humanitarian NGOs. I believed in it before Paris. I believed in it after Paris. Paris changed nothing with respect to the plight of Syrian and other refugees around the world. Yet it has changed things, and I'll come back to that in a minute. 100,000 against 4 million is also a token, but symbolically much more significant. It would establish us, again, as a leader on this issue. And again, what's happening without American leadership? The Europeans are flailing. We may see the European Union come apart as a political construct. You know, the economic union will persist, but it could come apart as a political construct because of the refugee issue. You're seeing the intense disagreements among European states. They are not going to resolve these matters by themselves. Only a global leader can start a process of treating a global crisis as a global crisis involving all stakeholders, and every country on earth is a stakeholder in this. But it isn't going to happen without sustained, focused U.S. leadership. Right now, the administration is defending the policy of accepting 10,000. I just checked in the first 2 months of the current fiscal year, October and November, we had resettled an overwhelming 437 Syrian refugees. We're nowhere near a trajectory to even meet that rather sad goal of 10,000. You look what the Canadians just did. A much smaller population, but with a prime minister that was prepared to stand up and say 30,000, and to be at the airport to meet the first families coming in. I wish we could see our president at the airport. As this insane debate is carried forth in the primaries, where a fractious primary field is united on one thing: let's not have any Syrian refugees, or if we're going to have them, let's be sure they're just Christians. It's not America's greatest day. And, when you think about who we are as a people, unless you're descended from Native Americans or your forebears were brought to this country in chains, unless you're in one of those two categories, you're an immigrant or a refugee, as all but one of those candidates are. They're lucky that someone like them wasn't in office when their forebears tried to get into this country. Actually, in most cases, we would have been a lot luckier if. I'm sorry. I know this is being recorded, but sometimes I can't help myself. So we, as a people, we need to take a collective deep breath and go sit under a tree somewhere and remember who we are and what we're about. The real irony, almost a tragedy, about the refugee debate is that this is one of those relatively rare moments when American values and American interests coincide. We all know we are about American exceptionalism. We are exceptional, almost unique among modern states. We are a nation that is founded on ideals, principles, and values, as well as interests. And as someone who's been in the field of diplomacy for most of my adult life, I see constantly how there's often tension or a collision between American values and American interests. And I'm delighted that with the center, you're bringing a particular focus on some of those values, like human rights and democracy. The refugee issue is not one of those points of friction or collision. Our fundamental values of who we are, it's written right there on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, and we will refuse them all entry. So there it is, a fundamental American value coinciding with the fundamental American national security interest, which is to take a definitive and ultimately successful stand against the terrorism practiced by Islamic State. The greatest challenge we can give Islamic State is by welcoming Syrian refugees into this country. If you noticed, back in September, when the great tidal wave of largely Syrian refugees hit Europe, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, initially took a public position saying they are welcome in Germany. Well, Islamic State social media went nuts. All kinds of postings. Don't believe it. It's a lie. It's a trap. They hate you. They're trying to lure you in so they can destroy you inside their borders. Don't believe it. Don't go there. Why this media firestorm? Because it undercut the Islamic State narrative of the true believers against the Crusaders. Angela Merkel, by making that statement, just completely belied their narrative that the Christian West, largely Christian West, was somehow fundamentally anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. That was a much more effective strike against them than any number of bombing runs on Raqqa. So Islamic State today, boy, they would have loved that debate Tuesday night. It's making their case that it is the West, led by America, against the people of the faith. So, again, with an opportunity to uphold our values and uphold our security interests, we're blowing it. I'm not going to get into the rise of nativist sentiments that political candidates are playing to. My real concern is, again, this absence of U.S. leadership on a key issue. Absence of U.S. leadership abroad and at home, quite frankly. This is a time for bold steps, for bold gestures that affirm who we are as a people, and that as a people, in upholding our values, we are going to defend our interests. To take this campaign against the Islamic State at the most fundamental level of values and of identity. I mentioned that I am on the board of Mercy Corps. Like our sister agencies, International Rescue Committee, Save the Children, others, the Syrian refugee issue is by far and away our biggest issue. We've got our people out in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Greece, and we operate inside of Syria, not with international staff, but Mercy Corps does. I'm making a pitch for the younger people in the room who are looking for a meaningful adventure in life. Join Mercy Corps. Just mercycorps.org. You can apply. We train national staffs to the same level that we train international staff. So we had a significant cadre of Syrians working for Mercy Corps who are able to operate effectively, completely independent of any international staff presence. And that's what they're doing all over Syria at enormous risk. But they are doing it. Syrians helping Syrians with international support. I said earlier that on the current trajectory, an unbelievably tragic situation left unmanaged and unchecked is simply going to get worse. Well, like every other international relief agency, like the UN system, we're running out of money because donor fatigue has set in, both in terms of private philanthropy and in terms of governmental philanthropy. We are seeing food rations to refugees in adjoining countries cut because the money simply isn't there. And what I see are two lines that are very troubling. The need is going to go up, and the resources are going to go down. So again, I've said this in other contexts, as bad as things are today, cherish the moment. Because looking back in 6 months, these will seem like the good old days. It is going to be a lot worse. And that's what I have been trying to do, to get the attention of the administration. Look, this, you can't ignore it. This is not going away. This is only going to get worse. So I would simply hope that the President, the Secretary of State, and others will come to that appreciation and push back against those forces in this country that would have us do the wrong thing morally, but also the wrong thing for our national security interests. I don't have to tell anybody in this room what refugee screening is like. It is the most intense scrutiny that any category of applicants for entry to this country go through. About the last thing you're going to do if you're going to try to get a terrorist into the States is go through the refugee process. It takes about 2 years, and the number of checks that you go through mean you look for easier ways, like finding people who don't need visas or who already have your passport, or, you know, you're not going to do it through refugees. So it's, you know, this is wrong at so many levels. You know, it's analytically wrong, it's morally wrong, it's wrong in terms of U.S. interests. And it's going to take a concerted stance by those who believe in a different America than is being described on the campaign trail, who believe in core American interests as well as core American values. It's going to take a stand equal to or greater in intensity and commitment than the rather amazing intensity and commitment being displayed by those who would work against our values and interests. You know, we collectively have got to get going. I believe the administration has the right orientation, but as sadly we have seen in so many issues related to the Middle East, the intentions and the actions do not synchronize. So it certainly isn't too late. It's never too late. But the darkness is descending. And as dark as it is now, I mean, I'm here to tell you, it is going to be a whole lot darker some months from now if we stay on the trajectory we are currently on. So now is the time. It is past time. But certainly there will be no better moment. There will only be worse moments down the road. I've just come back from Beirut. We can talk about some of the political dimensions of the Syrian crisis. Probably makes the refugee situation look good, if you'd like, but I won't further depress you on a rainy Washington morning further than I have. But I would like to just spend a final few words on what really bad could look like over the long run. Mercy Corps has a particular emphasis in its refugee programs in Syria's neighbors on youth, sort of that, 13 to 23 or 24 swath. They are, by and large, without access to any form of education. They are without access to skills training. They are without access to employment. In short, they are without access to hope. And we have seen what happens when you deny refugee populations even hope. It was no coincidence that radical Palestinian movements were given birth in refugee camps. and had no trouble recruiting young people willing to die because they would at least have something to die for. You know, the dream of a Palestine, the dignity that went with that struggle in a life that otherwise had only impoverishment and humiliation. Well, welcome to the next generation of the impoverished, of the hopeless, of the humiliated. If things continue as they are, I would expect to see a highly radicalized Syrian refugee population, not this year, not in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. Because they're not going to have much of an alternative, are they? And what will be the narrative that they absorb that, as they make their choices in life? That the West, led by the United States, turned its back on you. You know, left you to the counsels of despair and hopelessness in camps whose conditions we here in America can't even imagine. So, again, as bad as it is today, it's going to be worse in 6 months, worse in a year, and this will be the gift that keeps on giving to the region and the world for years and years to come in the absence of action. And in this sense, the administration is in many respects, in my view, as complicit as those who take these immoral stances against immigration. You know, all it takes, as has been said, for evil to succeed is for the good to do nothing. Well, evil is succeeding, and the good are pretty much sitting on our hands. So I would hope that this center and your allies in America and in the world will take a different position, force a different action. You know, we're still America. We're the greatest country and people on earth. This is the moment for us to stand by our values with the knowledge that for once our values and our interests coincide. So I wish you luck. You can certainly count on me as an ally if the Wall Street Journal will ever publish another word I write. But I have to give it, take my hat off to the Wall Street Journal. I wanted it there for reasons that would be obvious to you, and they were ready to do it. So, you know, there are little bits of courage here and there. Okay, thank you. Now we'll turn this into a dialogue.
May I borrow your folder here? Okay, I would just like to bring it to your attention in case you haven't yet looked at your folders that you picked up, a couple of the items that our fearless staff at the center have graciously put together with regards to facts and numbers relevant to the presentation by Ambassador Crocker, which was a very substantive and very frank presentation, and definitely morally challenging to all of us in this country to really stand up and measure up to this crisis. I just wanted a couple of things that he alluded to on the right-hand side, I think, of the folder, the screening process. For those of you, whether in the media or otherwise, looking for a thorough kind of delineation of step-by-step of what this process is, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I recommend to everybody concerned about the Syrian refugee crisis to fully understand this, because it's taken a dimension of its own kind of in la-la land in the debate that's taking place right now in the country without understanding the process. So I would recommend that everybody avail that to friends and foes, if you will, to educate them on this issue. The other one was the discrepancy between the growing crisis, as the ambassador mentioned accurately, and the diminishing support, if you will. And these two graphs are very important. They summarize both. So if you're not familiar with that, I would recommend that you also take a good look. Another unique thing we included in your package is our kind of legislative department at the center prepared. Again, the role of Congress somewhat tends to be ambiguous to many of us who work on Middle East issues. We kind of ignore Congress because we're disappointed in a lot of the shenanigans that take place in Congress with regards to Middle East policy. But I think it's important to look at this brief report on the right-hand side of your folder that's titled Status of Syrian Refugee Legislation Before Congress, because as the ambassador said, it is bad now, but it could get worse. And that applies to some of the congressional plans in terms of pieces of legislation and other measures that they are deliberating. And they're all listed there by name and by purpose. And that could make things a lot worse. Ambassador Crocker was very gracious to be willing to spend a few minutes, the balance of our time, answering your question, responding to your remarks. I would say the rules are basic. Just raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and staff will bring a microphone to you. And just state your name, affiliation, if you care to, and questions, preferably short, so we can go around the room and give everybody a chance. May I first recognize Dr. Ziadi, my colleague at the center. He was our resident scholar on Syria and Syrian refugees, if he would like to make a comment or raise a question to the ambassador. Ambassador, please. Would you like to stay there? Is that okay for television to stay there? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, we are missing such kind of leading voices speak on behalf of the Syrian refugees. You mentioned the case of the German Chancellor and the case of the Canadian Prime Minister. I think they show such kind of leadership. This is why I think I echo the Times to choose Chancellor Merkel to be the Woman of the Year, which I think it's really important. But I just have a comment and question. The comments that, unfortunately, we're seeing Syria right now as three different crises. The Syrian transition as one crisis, the ISIS as a different crisis, and the Syrian refugees as the third crisis. Those three crises are interconnected. And this is actually the failure of the policymakers to connect these three different crises and to take an actions that make it worse and worse. And if things getting like the way as it is right now, I think as you projected, maybe we'll expect more and more. I think the next case will be the global jihad. Already there is some indication of that. This is why my question that it's the UK Time newspaper published a survey last month, which shows that 76 of the Syrian refugees in Europe right now, they flee Syria because the barrel bombs of the Assad. If the United States imposed the no-fly zone since 2012, we will not have any of ISIS crisis or any of the refugee crisis right now. With the intensive Russian airstrikes on the populated area, which lifted 100,000 in the last 3 days to flee into Turkey, I don't see actually that we are going on the way to have a political solution or a way of having leadership to solve this interconnected crisis. What's your take on that, and how you see can the United States deal with the Russian hegemony into not only in Syria, in the whole Middle East? Thank you.
Those are excellent points. And I'm glad you brought them out. I was kind of hinting that there is a whole political dilemma out there that, and you cannot, as you rightly say, you cannot talk about these things really in isolation. I have been a proponent for some time of no-fly zones. With the Russian intervention, that has now gotten far more complex. But precisely because of the interlinkages of Syrian transition, Islamic State, and refugees, something has got to be done to change the dynamic, to change the context, or the spiral down is simply going to continue. And a no-fly zone would be a way of starting to change that dynamic. Many of you know this far better than I, but having just been in Lebanon earlier this week, I was freshly reminded of how the United States is increasingly perceived, in the Arab world generally, in the Arab Sunni world in particular. It's no longer an assertion. It is an accepted statement of fact that the anti-Sunni axis is Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, Tehran, Moscow, Washington. Because we talk about a campaign against Islamic State, a lot of people in the area see that as a campaign against Sunni Arabs. And when we do things like issue a prompt denial that the bombing recently of a Syrian military base was, we claim it was, we didn't do it, that reinforces that narrative. That, as you say, most of the victims in this mass slaughter in Syria, most of those who were driven out were slaughtered or driven out not by Islamic State, but by the Assad regime and its tactic of the barrel bombs. So we've got ourselves painted into a very, very dangerous corner in terms of perceptions of who we're allied with and who we're fighting against. We are seen as de facto in alliance with, again, Iranians, Russians, and the Assad regime against Sunni Arabs. No-fly zones, north and south, could begin to change that dynamic. It also is a pushback against the regime, against the Russians, and against the Iranians. And for those of you who are interested in detail, I mean, there are ways to structure this so that chances of a clash between us and the Russians would be minimal. The risk to our aviation would be minimal. But this could change the politics of this struggle in a way that might make a political negotiation possible. Because right now, I have the highest regard for Secretary Kerry, but this effort at a political negotiation is going to go nowhere because the Russians, the Iranians, and Bashar al-Assad think they're on a roll. Why should they negotiate? And the reality is they're not going to, as long as they think they're winning. No-fly zones would have a humanitarian value and send a very important signal that, in fact, we do stand with those who are being slaughtered and driven out of the country, and we stand against a regime that right now we're seen as tacitly supporting. So, a very important step, really, really hard to do. If we'd done it before the Russians came in, it would be different. We probably wouldn't have had the Russians coming in. But again, the consequences of inaction can be as severe as misguided actions.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Caroline? Right here, please.
I'm Caroline Vicini from the European Union's delegation here in Washington. First of all, you described the crisis that we see in Europe due to the huge influx of refugees. And certainly it is a challenge to our structures and to our institutions. But I hope certainly that we are resilient and we can manage this. I think that any country or any geographic entity that would have been in this situation would have had difficulties to cope because no system is built for an influx like this one. And the places where the people come in are small touristy islands and areas which are not at all built for or have the infrastructure for receiving these people. And Although you see it's been very well reported here, a lot of the political consequences. What has been a bit underreported is actually the outpour of solidarity among Europeans as such, civil society, NGOs, individuals that are really playing a huge role. Having come to that, we have, of course, from the European Union side, been in constant contact with our American counterparts in discussing what they can do to address this global crisis. And we have also come to the conclusion that it's probably not going to happen that the numbers of refugees that the US will take in will increase, at least not in the near future, and at the pace that have been described here, it will not make any difference in the short term at least. But we also see that it's not going that fast in providing other types of support because, for example, the Balkans are suffering a lot under the influx of refugees, and they have quite weak structures, and there the US could be really crucial in helping out with the good contacts that we see that the United States have with the Balkans. Also the same thing in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. Could you comment a little bit on what the US is doing in those areas and what you would like to see more?
Well, thanks for the question. As I tried to indicate, what the U.S. is doing is too little at every level and in every dimension. Resources obviously are important; they're critical, as I described, and as Khalil has. I love it. I hadn't seen the packet, but as I was describing divergent lines, you would actually map them out. So resources are critical, but it's the intangible that I think is most lacking, and it's the most important. It is the U.S. Exerting a leadership role, and that doesn't mean ordering people around and telling them what to do or not to do. It simply means engaging. Of saying to our European friends, we know this is a global crisis that is hitting you hard. Let's sit down and talk about how we, all of us, manage it. What does the first line need? And that's Greece and the Balkans. They face a challenge that's somewhat different than that faced by Northern Europe. I mean, perhaps not lesser or greater, but different. And they have fewer indigenous resources to meet it. So who needs what? Who's worried about what? Who can do what? Somebody needs to do what we did at the last global refugee crisis at the end of World War II, which is step forward. And you can calculate the odds of that happening in the last year of a presidential administration as well as I can. But without that, in this country, for Europe, for the world, the legacy for the next American president is going to be a very grim one indeed. So, we are without a concerted effort that I think requires U.S. leadership. We're not going to get anywhere good, because what we're seeing, at least from my perspective, I'm glad you're here because you can present a European viewpoint, are the divisions with the newer members of the European Union taking often dramatically different positions on how to deal with refugee influxes than countries like Germany or France. And I have to say this, by the way, it wasn't as widely remarked as it should have been, but in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, President Hollande reaffirmed France's commitment on accepting refugees, didn't back away a bit. I thought that was a tremendous act of moral courage, but also, again, national interest. But I would like to see my country step up in the way so many of our European allies are, and try to bring people together for a comprehensive look at a global problem. And that involves our Middle Eastern friends, too. It involves our friends in Asia. It involves the world. But it frankly takes a world leader to do this, and I don't see that leadership.
Okay, Mohammed, microphone over there, please.
My name is Mohammed Awais. I'm not affiliated with anybody. But I'm a Palestinian refugee, a result of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And I see what's happening to the Syrian population now is happening. What happened to us is happening to them now. Don't answer the first question. The question is the Islamophobic rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party, and especially Trump and company, working? I guess yes. I have a story from my family. Last week, I had a member of my family who is a medical doctor, top of her class, went to the airport with her daughter who's 3 years old. Both of them had visas to come to America to visit. She have a very high-paying job in one Arab country who is supposedly friends with the United States of America. The decision was made at the airport, you cannot board the airplane. Go back and talk to the embassy. Having said that, knowing that you are a former ambassador and you know the procedure, is Donald Trump with his fear-mongering succeeding? And what is the procedure? Who makes these decisions? I know the person. I don't want to say much because I don't want her to get more in trouble, okay? But that friendly country is the best friend now of the Russians and their attack on the Syrian people. What is the procedure? As an ambassador, do you know what the procedure is? Who makes these decisions? Or maybe it's the political affiliation or the mentality of the guy, because it was in a country where now immigration is done. U.S. immigration is done in that country across the pond. Does the ambassador have anything to do with it? Or now it's becoming free for all? Any crazy can create problems for refugees. I'm Palestinian refugee. I'm not Syrian refugee. And you said 6 months from now it's going to be much worse. That means the poor Syrian refugees are not going to find a place to hide from the cold. We are coming up to cold weather. I would like to hear your answer now.
Okay, there are obviously several elements there. The way U.S. Immigration is structured, not quite unique in the world, but exceptional. Visa decisions, any form of non-immigrant visa, are the responsibility of an individual consular officer. There are guidelines, but there isn't a checklist. Check all these boxes, you're eligible, you're not. These are inherently subjective judgments, and I know that. I served as a consular officer early in my career. It's hard. And the officer is ultimately responsible for the decision he or she makes. Now, by statute, ambassadors cannot interfere, for exactly that reason. Ambassadors cannot interfere in consular decisions. The officer has the responsibility and the authority. An ambassador cannot issue a visa. I cannot. I don't have that that authority. Only a consular officer can do so, and this puts a horrific responsibility now on my young colleagues. It's their decision. Whoever the poor officer was that ultimately issued the fiancé visa to Tashfeen Malik can kiss his or her career goodbye, sadly. So this wave of racist and ethnic bias is going to have its impact on young officers trying to do the right thing. But unlike the system in most European countries, there is no cut dry yes no. It's an individual and inherently subjective judgment.
I may follow up.
Can we go around the room, please, and then I'll get back to you.
Just quick.
But look, there is a big crowd, so let's just the person in the corner back there, please, had his hand, and then Jafar by the door.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. Years ago, we had no-fly zones in Iraq. I wonder how successful they were, and whether you think that the U.S. forfeited a large measure of its influence in the region by its precipitous withdrawal of troops from Iraq, not to mention Afghanistan, and whether you think when you talk about all these things the U.S. should do at every dimension, whether or not you're also referring to an increase in military strength in the region, just as our forces increased in Vietnam from the 400 special forces sent by JFK to 500,000 under LBJ.
The no-fly zone in northern Iraq worked pretty well. It worked far less well in southern Iraq, and you touch on a very important point. The reason it worked well in the north and not in the south is in the north, in the Kurdish region, you had forces on the ground. The Kurdish Peshmerga. I made several visits to northern Iraq in 2002, 2001, 2002, and saw it firsthand. They controlled the ground, we controlled the air, and that kept the Iraqis out. The southern Shia didn't have that advantage. So Saddam basically went about his killing of southern Iraqis by other means. Rather than using his helicopters, he used ground elements. And that's important because if you're looking at no-fly zones in Syria, there's going to have to be a ground component. That should not be us. Again, we're U.S. boots on the ground or every Islamic State recruiter's ultimate wet dream. We cannot do that. In the south, maybe the Jordanians could. In the north, it gets really complicated because of the Turkish-Kurdish tensions. But for no-fly zones to succeed, and the Kurdish experience in the 90s bears that out, there's got to be control of the ground as well as control of the air. Otherwise you're going to see what you saw in southern Iraq. And I was there in 2003 for the uncovering of some of the mass graves, the occupants of which were not all placed there in the 91 uprising. It was the subsequent decade that got a lot of people killed while we still patrolled the skies because we weren't controlling the ground. One thing I would not do is, as I'm suggesting, goodness, don't send the 101st Airborne in to fight Islamic State. That will totally make their day. Did our withdrawal from Iraq precipitate some of what we're seeing now? It certainly did. But, I've argued for some time it wasn't the withdrawal of our military that made the crucial negative difference. It was the withdrawal of our political engagement. When I was out there as ambassador, you had the Secretary of State there every couple of months, the Secretary of Defense when she wasn't there, and the President on the phone all the time to everybody. That all stopped when we pulled our forces out. So our political disengagement has much more to do, I think, with the subsequent unraveling than our military withdrawal. We seem, unfortunately, to link the one tightly to the other. We're only politically engaged if our forces are on the ground. well, if you're politically engaged, maybe your forces don't have to be on the ground. But we disengaged politically as much as we did militarily.
Jafar, Roxanne, right next to you there.
Thank you. My name is Jafar Jafari with Al Mayadeen TV. As a respected diplomat, Mr. Ambassador, who witnessed the U.S. policy disasters since 1979, as you put it, I wonder if you can touch upon two things related to U.S. policy. In your speech, it was clear that you're arguing for global leadership of the United States. Now, does that global leadership translate, or is it synonymous with unilateral moves on the one hand? And on the other, the U.S. policy that has been applied, at least in Syria, has been calling for regime change and as a byproduct of creative chaos, as it was called. And now we hear Secretary Kerry saying clearly, as recently as 2 days ago, that the U.S. policy is no longer trying to achieve regime change in Syria in particular. Thank you.
When I speak of U.S. leadership, I mean that quite literally. The U.S. to play a leading role with our friends and our allies around the world. Unilateral actions not only are not going to solve anything, they'll only make things worse. These are collective challenges that require a collective response, but I see an urgent need for somebody to orchestrate that response, not make it, not do it, but to orchestrate it, to lead, as it were. And by leading, that means building consensuses, not issuing diktats. So very much against unilateral action. That's going to solve nothing at this critical juncture. But, collective commitment can manage a lot of things that are unmanaged at the moment, even if it can't solve them. And with respect to U.S. policy towards Syria, I worry greatly of the perception, as I said earlier, that there is a Washington, Damascus, Tehran, Moscow axis that is effectively in support of Bashar al-Assad. And therefore against the largely Sunni population that he is busy killing and driving out of the country. This is not in our interests, and it is inconsistent with our values. And it is going to intensify a conflict. It is not going to put it on the road to resolution.
All right, question now from the West Bank. Please, go ahead.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Sahar Chaudhry. I'm with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. The over 4 million refugees, 7.5 million IDPs plus, are unlikely to be resettled or be able to return to their homes when this conflict eventually ends. Are there policies and program support that the U.S. and the international community can be pursuing now for the eventual end of this situation, whenever it does end, that will allow the communities who have a lot of distrust amongst religious ethnic lines to eventually have a country for themselves again?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sadly, I see no, I can't even imagine a resolution to the Syrian conflict right now. I just can't imagine it. I do hope there is a more concerted effort to manage it than we've seen so far, and to do much more to support those who have had to flee the country. There's a lot of us out there organizationally are heavily invested in this, and with more resources could do much more. Providing education, providing employment opportunities, and working to do what you're targeted at, to develop civil societies among refugee populations, to facilitate conversations among refugees of different ethnic or religious backgrounds, for example, to foster conversations and understandings that, when circumstances do permit, as one hopes someday they will, for refugees to return home with a different sense of who they are and how they can work with one another. My organization, Mercy Corps, and others could facilitate that dialogue, but it takes resources to do. And right now, we don't even have the resources to see that people eat decently, let alone work on critical issues of civil society and understanding. And that's what I mean about a bad situation getting so very much worse. If we could stabilize refugee populations, work to give them better lives and a hope for a future, we'd be going a long way to creating a post-crisis environment that would be, far more positive than what we had pre-crisis. But again, the lines on your graphs are showing we're going the opposite direction.
Good morning. Molly McCluskey, Middle East Eye, and member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. Tomorrow's spending bill will vote on visa waiver provisions, as you're aware, of people that have visited countries deemed high risk. What will that mean for citizens that hold dual citizenship or Americans with multi-citizenship as well? Can you comment?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. The good news in the omnibus spending bill is that the anti-refugee elements of previous bills are not there. I mean, the bad news is some very discriminatory language particularly on visa waiver, the visa waiver program. And as I understand the draft, I have to say here, I have not sat down and read the text yet. But as I understand it, in addition to requiring visas for individuals who would otherwise have that requirement waived because of travel to select countries, it goes into a very dangerous area, saying in effect that a British-born British citizen who happened to have, say, a Syrian or Iranian father, even though the citizen in question had never been to that country, would no longer be eligible for a visa waiver. Wow. That just really scares me. It is highly discriminatory. It is discriminatory based, not on who you are or where you went or what you did, but about who your father or your mother is. And if we're prepared to pass legislation like that, what are we prepared to do about our own citizens? Fear is one of the most dangerous emotions on earth, and fear is making us behave in a way that is contrary to our values and our interests. So, boy, I hope they pull that out of there, and we are all going to have to be very, very vigilant. I'm not going to demonize those who are inserting such language. I think they are motivated by fear, but that's what I meant about that collective deep breath and sitting down under a tree and working this through so that we are not taking steps that are ultimately counter to our own national security. They're corrosive of our values. And if you take this step, boy, what other steps might follow from it? So thank you for raising it. Again, the spending bill avoided the very worst, but there are still some really bad things in there.
Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Scott Cooper. Excuse me.
Human rights first.
I am indeed. I'm a retired Marine that served under you both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now at Human Rights First. I certainly take to heart your point about American leadership, and I wonder if I could draw you out a little bit more Just on specifics, President Roosevelt started a War Refugee Board. Your point about orchestrating this is critical. What are the first steps you would recommend, whether it's by Congress, whether it's by the administration, to start using some American leadership?
Well, staying focused on the refugee issue, there are several things. So there is a very robust, elaborate refugee resettlement structure in this country, and Human Rights First, of course, is part of it. So start by convening, those agencies that are involved in resettlements. So to ensure we've got a nationally coordinated effort, and again, the way our system is structured, these are state and local requirements, but for a national coordinating effort about how we're organized to handle refugees at home. What's the resource picture? Who needs what where? Then take that abroad. I would like to see us convene a refugee summit, appropriately prepared, that we would convene and chair. With such an initiative, a lot of other work would start to get done. What's the situation in Europe, country by country? What are the dynamics? What do they need from us? What do they not need from us? How are our Middle Eastern allies looking at this and resourcing it? So a summit itself is really not the start of a process. In many ways, it could be a culmination of it by being the forcing mechanism to start these hard conversations among all the participants. I'd start at home, I'd start abroad, and part of the start at home has got to be a conversation between the administration and the Hill and on the Hill about, again, taking that deep breath. Let's look at our values, let's look at our interests, let's look at our alliances, and let us then proceed from there. Not here to give plugs for Human Rights First, except I am. It's a terrific organization. After you've contributed to the Arab Center, and Mercy Corps, then it's I'm resident in the state of Texas right now, and there we've got a legal challenge brought by the state against resettlement of refugees in the state, and I'm working with Human Rights First to file a declaration or a brief as part of that case. There's bad stuff going on out there, and as we look to step forward, we got to watch our backs because there's some pretty frightening things abroad in the land right now.
All right, let's make the next 3 questions real quick, please. Jamal, over here, yes.
Yes, my name is Jamal Hashwe. I work with Global Hope Network International in Jordan, and we're very much working with the Mercy Corps guys and visiting many of the Syrian refugees in Jordan for the last few years. My big question away from politics, Your Excellency talked about hope. And so many of the Syrians and other refugees in Jordan have totally lost hope. They don't have a way back to go back home. They see the rejection of many countries, including this leading, merciful country that's still debating about welcoming 10,000, while in Jordan we have hundreds of thousands of refugees that are sharing our small loaf of bread. The big question is, how can we help to re-inject hope in their lives? And also on the humanitarian side, as many of them are really taking $20 a day per person from the United Nations, and that has stopped for some time. Many of them go to bed without food. how can we, with the heart that God has given us, be of help to them? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pretty horrible situation. It isn't all about the money, but a lot of it's about the money. Whatever we can do individually and collectively to overcome the wave of donor fatigue that is sweeping the world, to indicate that these are human beings. They need our help, and it is our duty to help them. We've got to re-energize both governments and populations to be more generous in support of these populations, because, as you say, we're seeing stipends eliminated, we are seeing food rations cut, and that's just going to get worse, because without, again, say, a summit approach to re-energize the global community, that line of resources is just going to keep going down as the numbers of refugees continues to increase. And our friends in Jordan and Lebanon are bearing an enormous burden, and they're kind of doing it by themselves. So again, the richest country on earth sort of has an obligation here, but that obligation isn't going to be met without presidential leadership. So it kind of comes back to that.
Rhonda?
Thank you. Rhonda Fahmy, I'm on the board here of the Arab Center, D.C. Nice to see you, Ambassador. I just got back from Palestine and Jordan. I was there with a group of congressional staff. But behind us and in front of us was a trail of senators coming through, from both parties, and they were visiting the refugee camps in Jordan. So it made me think about your comment on the resources, that there may be a case to be made here in the U.S. within Congress and the Appropriations Committee, that if they're not going to take the refugees, which I think that's a really tough sell here right now in this environment. By the way, Democrats and Republicans, I don't see a Democrat in the White House allowing refugees in either. I don't think this is a Republican thing, but I do see a case to be made for more appropriations to help the refugees where they are. Wondering if you can comment on that.
I'm delighted to hear that there were House and Senate delegations out there. Yes, and again, I don't mean to just keep harping on this, but wouldn't it be great if the president invited members of those delegations, everyone, Republican and Democrat, who went out to these countries, visited these camps, if he invited them to the White House to say, thank you for your interest, thank you for taking the trouble to go out and see with your own eyes. Now, what are we going to do about it? Because you're quite right. I mean, this is not a partisan issue. This is a national issue, and sadly, I think you're quite right. I've been getting some very interesting mail since I did my op-ed last month, and a lot of my very interesting mail comes from self-declared Democrats. So yeah, I get that. So we've got a negative bipartisanship on refugee resettlement. Well, let's see if we can get some positive bipartisanship going on supporting refugees where they may be currently. But it's going to take leadership. The members of those delegations are not going to come together back here and say, we are going to do this, that, and the other. It's just not going to happen. But if they all go to the White House, that could start something.
George.
George Cody. Ambassador, you mentioned a number of times, thank you. George Cody, former executive director of the American Task Force for Lebanon. Thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. It was quite enlightening. You mentioned the theme over and over again about U.S. leadership. Would you care to comment on the absence of Arab leadership? It just doesn't seem to be present. Is there anything that could be done to somehow invigorate or some initiative to be taken to see some leadership coming out of the region rather than just the United States?
Yeah, well, I know I bored you all to death, but here it comes again. You may see Arab states start to step forward when the U.S. seriously engages. Everybody is kind of watching us and not seeing much, so if we're not doing anything, why should they? It's just a hard truth. It's the 25th anniversary of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. February would be 25 years since liberation. I think of the coalition that came together to expel Iraq from Kuwait. The greatest international coalition since the Second World War, in which Saudi, Egyptian, and Syrian forces were all present. Well, do you think the region or the international community would have come together in that coalition without U.S. leadership? Not a chance. Absolutely not a zip, zero, none. This is a challenge of a different nature, but there's one common thread. Nothing good is going to happen without the United States at the center of it. That's been the way the world has worked since World War II. It still is. Our relative strength and influence certainly have diminished, but it's still there. And most importantly, there is no other source for it. Our Arab friends came together 25 years ago because we led. I think they could and would again, but it's going to require that same dynamic from our side.
Ram, would you?
Graham Bannerman with Middle East Institute. Let me say that we're in a group here that we're all agreement, I think, that we need to do more for Syrian refugees. But I do a lot of speaking outside of Washington. And what I see in your presentation, a certain amount of arguments that would fall on hollow ears that seem to be contradictory. On the one, to give you an example, you say that we support American values, that's why we do this, but then you began your speech by saying that a substantial majority of Americans oppose it. So you're trying to impose on the substantial American people in the name of democracy to bring these people here. Secondly, we say that we have the most rigorous system possible. It takes 2 years for a refugee to get here from Syria. When you go say that to people out in the countryside, they say, yes, but it's taken 4 years to bring 2,500 in. How do you go next year 10,000 without changing your standards and your values in doing that? So can we trust Washington to handle these things well?
Yeah, look, on the first part, I am making a plea not to override public opinion, but to engage public opinion. I hear the negative voices out there. I don't hear very many positive ones explaining why support for refugees, including resettlement, is in the national interest as well as in accordance with national values. That effort by the administration or by others is largely absent as the negative voices capture the airwaves and persuade public opinion. So by no means am I saying ignore public opinion. I'm saying engage in order to produce a different narrative to get people to think about this. Because right now, look, at times of crisis, the fallback is fear and reactions produced from fear. I'm arguing for a more complex but critical discussion that is largely absent in the country. It's certainly absent from the debates because it's far easier to let the fear factor predominate. So I'm just asking for a different discussion. And I can't think of a better group than the people in this room to begin to lead that. And the second part of that was?
2,500 to...
Oh, yeah. Look, again, it's a question of how much priority do you want to give this? If you make this a presidential imperative, the resources are there to do it. I've been involved in particular with the issue of Iraqis and Afghans who have worked for us and because of that are in jeopardy. Well, yeah, we could do the screening without taking anything away from it, but we could do it a lot faster if we simply made it a higher priority. So I would be asking, let's take this from a 7th tier priority and make it a top tier priority, and put the resources and the manpower into it to do screening that is no less thorough, but to do it far more quickly than we're doing it now. Right now, it's so far down the line of priorities that it takes what I think is an unconscionable length of time. This is a global crisis. Let's treat it like one, which manifestly we're not doing now.
All right. With this, I would like to thank everyone for being here today and for your lively participation in the discussion. Could you please join me in thanking Ambassador Crocker for his... Thank you for taking time in your busy schedule to be with us. And thank you to the center staff working hard to make this happen. Appreciate it. See you at another event in the future.